Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I'm very pleased to be joined by Charley Rattan. Charley, as most of you will probably know, is a global hydrogen advisor and principal at Charley Rattan Associates. Has worked since the beginning, really, of World Hydrogen Leaders and done a lot of training for us, and is going to be speaking at this year's World Hydrogen Congress, which has been further expanded into World Hydrogen Week, so down in Rotterdam, 9th to the 13th of October. So welcome, Charley.
Hiya.
Good to see you again.
And you.
I like your backdrop, which is suitable because you're going to be doing a masterclass on floating wind, in October at World Hydrogen Week. Floating wind has obviously been developing off the back of obviously fixed mountings or fixed offshore wind. So can you give us a little bit of an update on floating wind and have a sort of discussion, and then we'll sort of take it through to really see the impact that could potentially have on hydrogen as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nadeem. Welcome everybody. I suppose the key thing is the speed of movement in the floating wind sector, and indeed the floating wind and hydrogen sector since we last delivered the course. For example, Project Tampen, an oil and gas floating wind project, has come to fruition. It's live. It is a new concept of using floating wind to decarbonize carbon in the form of oil and gas. Slightly counterintuitive, but that's part of a thing called the INTOG leasing round, which a lot of people have forgotten about, and it negates the need for grid and helps oil and gas decarbonize. So that's one strand of it. I suppose this week, hot off the press, Nadeem, we've had a thing called the Ostend Declaration. A lot of political leaders there, including our own Grant Shapps, and they announced, I think, quadrupling effectively of the offshore capacity of the North Sea within a very, very tight timeline. Significant parts of that will be from floating wind. I'm thinking of the ScotWind element of Orkney and Shetland, also Norway. And I suppose it doesn't have to be deeper waters anymore. Some of the tech you see behind me can actually get into shallows as well. So it's not either or.
For the technical, for the people that aren't maybe technically familiar, so offshore wind is obviously typically fixed to the base of the ocean floor, and typically has a limit of the sort of 20 to 30 meters. But although I'm beginning to see some mountings, I think, going to a depth of 58 meters, I saw. And then floating wind gives you obviously further latitude to go into deeper water. But how deep does floating wind go? And also around, I guess, the North Sea, which is very shallow. I don't know how, there's obviously deep parts of the North Sea, such as sort of some of the areas as you come out of it going up towards Norway. But yeah, give us a little bit of understanding from that technical standpoint.
It's a great question. That's a great question. Actually, how deep? I think some of the California ones are over a kilometre deep, and that might favour what you might call, if you were to think of an upturned tower, the Norwegians call that a spar. They're perhaps leader in that kind of tech. That is well suited. In fact, Norwegians say that anything under 100 meters is shallow to them, rather like your description. But there are different types. If you look at the tech, the stuff that like a tripod type of design, there are things that are on concrete called caissons that go back to the Second World War. And they have got advantages too. So I suppose that would mean that you could actually bring the power to where you need it. You don't not rely on the wind speed. And I suppose Project Tampen, the one I was referring to in Norwegian waters, 5 oil and gas fields being decarbonised with floating wind, and that is operational now. And I suppose when they're expended, the fields, then you might think, well, that might be a good ops base for a wider Tampen 2 or 3. And then you'd have a real generator for floating wind. That's hydrogen, replacing some of the oil and gas infrastructure on the platforms as they avoid the decommissioning costs there. So you're finding this, we used to call it the rule of 30, which I've come across twice. I came across it in IT, bizarrely, when Word documents any more than 30, and it tend to not do good things to your PC because your PC couldn't handle it. And I suppose if you go above 30 meters for fixed foundation, use a lot of steel. It's not technically that they couldn't do it, it's just that it's not worth it. You use so much steel that you can't make any money out of it. But like you said, there's been I think my old company SSE and others pushed that envelope, and I think up to, was it 58, 60 meters, which might be suitable in certain locations. Certainly good news for the steel industry. So but you don't have to. One other aspect about Tampen is that concrete is being used. Concrete, known about since Roman times. Some of it's still there. Some of it's still out there in Italy and elsewhere, which indicates that you're not tied to a 20-25-year project life for your foundations, which is also good news. It's also perhaps a good route to lower carbon production of that kind of foundation, if you like, for want of a better word, for floating and indeed fixed machines. So concrete is slightly surprisingly coming through as a mechanism. Price reductions are coming through, and the turbines, as with fixed, are getting bigger and bigger. They're a year or two behind. I think we're up to 15 megawatt turbines now for fixed, and it's not far behind for floating. Every time I look, it's bigger, which drives the cost down. That's the biggie. Turbine costs are a large part of offshore wind projects. It's balance of prance in comparison is quite small. So innovation, and I suppose another thing to stress to answer your question is the global nature of it. It's a quantum leap. So since we last spoke on floating wind at World Hydrogen Leaders and I think it was Amsterdam, we've seen a global increase in interest in the sector. The Americans with the floating wind shot or earth shot, combined with the hydrogen shots. Then we've seen interest in the Philippines. I've seen interest in Africa. I've seen interest in Spain, the Canaries, Norway, India, and elsewhere. So, and it's not always confined to deeper water. It might be also the other driver, bring the power to where you need it. Clusters, for example. Could you tow your wind farm to where you need it? Forget all the constraints about seabed, hard crystalline rock, other uses. It might almost a plug and play type of solution, isn't it? If you've got an cluster, well, why not bring in your floating wind farm? It doesn't matter whether it's a meter a second lower than the optimal. It's still a route to net zero. So we've got big backers now coming into floating wind, interesting tectonics, a lot of innovation. And the other thing to mention, I suppose, is that floating wind and hydrogen, when we started giving our course for World Hydrogen Leaders a few years ago now, there were very few examples. It was all theoretical. It was design, it's project development. But now, for example, Project Life off the French coast is producing hydrogen from a floating wind platform. So it's real. And we watched that we'll certainly discuss that in the course and in the session in World Hydrogen Week. Here in the UK, South Wales, they're looking at a tech called Dolphin, very similar in some respect to Project Life. It's a floating platform, but it's for the production of hydrogen, not electricity. So we're rewriting the rule book. I used to write environmental statements. This wind farm is the production of electrical energy. But it's not. Just get rid of the word electrical. We're into molecules now. It's storable, it's usable. You might even want to look at a thing called power to X, this mysterious phrase. Sounds like something from Star Trek, doesn't it? But it just means that your power might be floating wind. But often it might be methanol, or it might be ammonia, or it might be something else. Who knows what the project dynamics are? So floating wind is a major part of the P2X, if you like, agenda as well. So it's a bit of again, when people talk about Swiss knives and things like that, the versatility. And floating wind, I think there are over 80 different types now. People think it's this Norwegian spar, the upturned tower, which is, but it's not the only one. The background, the tripods, the concrete ones, and it's not necessarily one size fits all. You might find that what suits the Philippines is different from what suits California, or what suits
And do you see it overtaking the fixed base is it, I mean, there are obviously different costs. There's movement, obviously. There is such slight movement, I guess, in floating wind, which obviously therefore creates wear. Or actually, it's more of a question: is there more maintenance in floating wind than there is in fixed, or is that yet to be proven yet?
It's actually a great question again, because I think one difference between offshore wind and the onshore variety is the maintenance costs becomes crucial, and that for the availability and that maintenance is crucial. I suppose one advantage is that it's almost plug and play, isn't it? So you don't need to actually maintain it on site. Why not unplug it, tow it to the nearest port, plug in a spare that you have to have ready, and you don't lose any. So it might be an advantage. To be honest, there's been so few examples. It's difficult to know yet. There's only really been a high wind off the north of Scotland and Tampa and one or two demonstrators, and I wouldn't like to extrapolate, but in theory, To come back to your original question, it's not fixed versus floating necessarily. I was the project manager of the Isla offshore wind farm, for example, hard crystalline rock, and it's sloped. So you might actually, if I was to redesign Isla, which is back out there, I might be looking for both. I might say, well, where it's shallow, the steel costs or whatever foundation is optimal might suit the site. But as we go further out, then it might be the floating, which is in the deeper water, and you might then look for other aspects of the wider picture as well. Could you get vessel safe anchorage on site if you selected one particular type of technology? I know they're out there, and you might avoid some of the problems around grid. It's not easy to put an electrical cable 100 miles out to Isla, wherever it's going. So you might avoid some of that. It will be a case of when we developers look at projects, we have a number of scenarios. A lot of these stay in-house. You'll all have a best case and a best wind result, a best bird case, a best environmental case. And you would model that. And you do that largely on what we call desktop modeling, which is far easier than actually going out and putting the kit in and trialing it. So it's far more effective. So you'd see what works. But as I say, I see great harmonies between fixed and floating. I certainly don't see either. Not resource-wise. Some of the people from the floating sector say, look, you're going to open up 80% of the world's seabed. Looking at this tech, so I wouldn't dismiss that. From a nascent, so it's proven now, so we know that it's viable. High wind has proved that, but very few examples for the ops and maintenance figures yet. There are some theoretical things that if you were to tow it to site, then you can do it safely in a big warehouse or your own harbour. And you don't need to put people at risk out in the North Sea, 100 miles. Fixing people on ropes is not a good thing to have. So that's yet to be played out. We've all got the models, and we've all seen the models, and we all read the reports. But a few more, perhaps Project Tampan, Kincardine, South Wales is moving through. Perhaps the Project Life can give us further intelligence, real world. Might be, again, commercially sensitive. I don't think that they necessarily share that. We'll try and get what we can, but sometimes the companies like to keep that under wraps.
Yeah, excellent, fascinating stuff. And I mean, it's clearly a huge area for development. And I mean, I guess the floating advantages also. I think, I mean, you talked about the optics and optimizing for location, for distance from your point of demand. But I guess the key thing is being able to tap much greater wind resource. Using floating wind and especially, I guess that the big thing with hydrogen is that cost element, because it's going to be cheaper to, I guess, connect. So you're talking about connecting, so producing the hydrogen offshore, so the electrolysis.
Well, that's another great question, because the early assumptions. It was actually the Germans that came up with this. They found out how hard it was to electrify the North Sea. They did some high-level studies, and some fairly eye-watering quotes, surprise, surprise, came back. Water and electricity is not necessarily a good mix. And if you do it in the North Sea, adverse conditions, it's not a good idea. So that doesn't mean you give up. What else is out there? And I think that's where hydrogen, now the original assumptions were that we'd do it onshore. The old Shell mantra, we always used to say we work on the beach for some reason. We always do it on the beach, whatever we can. Now that's been challenged. Like the challenge that wind farmers for electrical energy, that's a challenge. Let's get rid of it. It's obsolete now. So some of the new designs are, well, a number of them, but could we repurpose some oil and gas assets? I think about 4,000 of them in the North Sea. And we're on the hook for those. There's a big decommissioning cost. People have forgotten about that. The oil and gas companies certainly haven't. So could we avoid those by repurposing? So we could put a nice circular argument together. Could we reuse it, repurpose it? Well, that's good. And could we put some kind of electrolyzer on the top and marinize it? Yes, we can. And can we perhaps have another one for an accommodation block? It's already there, perhaps. And then what else can we do? And we're seeing the first moves to that, aren't we? With the with some of the schemes offshore, Gigastack and the Tampan one, oil and gas. It's an oil and gas field being decarbonised by floating wind. And now some really interesting stuff coming up in Scotland and indeed the Celtic Sea, and Project Life, which again is operational. So we will see. We'll see. I can't answer your question yet fully, but we can see the trajectories. how the solutions might be integrating very, very smartly for the energy transition.
And I remember the Aquaventus project, which is obviously the sort of German project. They were looking to use an island, and indeed, obviously, there's the Danish sort of solutions of artificial islands, and then there are, I think, some of the more decentralized solutions of looking at the electrolysis on each turbine. I guess the big question then is around water. So, are you seeing much innovation around the desalination area?
Yeah, it's again, we cover it in our course that we already do for World Hydrogen Leaders. That, for example, Project SHIP, SHYP, the one that I was involved with, is looking exactly at that. Do we need to use desalination? Can we use seawater? Yeah. And there's some very positive aspects, not just of SHIP, but others as well. Indeed, an office has just been opened in Aberdeen by the SHIP, which indicates at least some progress and some promising technological advancements. And that might be a game changer as well if that proves successful. The problem isn't necessarily the water. I think the tech is there. Yeah. The problem is what to do with some of the side effects. And I think Project Life has looked at that as well. I suppose the teaser would be to sign on the courses and come along to the session and learn a little bit more about where the solutions for that might lie. And of course, that would indeed. Water, splitting of water is important to us on the renewable side. And if you could split the seawater and get similar results, then it might bring others into the renewable fold, help the decarbonisation agenda. And I suspect there's some very promising movements there as well.
Excellent. Well, it's been fascinating to catch up, Charlie. It's great to see you. We look forward to seeing you again in Rotterdam and indeed on the World Hydrogen Leaders platform, delivering more courses. Always engaging, always interesting to talk to you. So many thanks.